Welcome to the Talking Security podcast. We will talk about items related to Microsoft security.
Hello, welcome again at a new recording of the Talking Security podcast. This time again in the Defender for DevSecOps series. And we're back with Pouyan and Sander. What are we going to do today?
Today we're going to talk about the build section of DevSecOps. So last episode we talked about code, and this episode we're going to talk all about the build environment and build process.
So how to build such piece of software or some infrastructure, for example, to enroll that. So let's dive in. Do we have, first of all, do we have anything to announce? It's almost MVP Summit, so all three of us, we are moving to America for a week. So definitely. And we will do some recordings there, I guess.
Yeah, hopefully we'll.
Yeah, we'll take our gear, not this gear, but we'll take the gear with us, and then let's see if we can talk to some people over there. So really looking forward. It will be my first time, so hopefully, it will be awesome. First time in Seattle.
Your first time at the summit as well?
Yes.
Oh, really? I
Yes.
thought you were gone there for like a million times already.
I think I'm the youngest MVP in this room.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly not the youngest person in the room.
No, definitely not. But let's dive into the DevSecOps build process.
Sure.
What is it? What things do we need to cover?
Well, I kind of see this in two different sections. So you have like the build process and you have the build environment. And I think it's really, really important to talk about the security aspect here, because in the normal DevOps flow, when someone talks about DevOps, they usually talk about CI/CD, like building your software when something changes and then releasing it automatically, instead of doing it by hand with FTP or just doing stuff by hand. But with DevSecOps, it's all about the security aspect. So how do we make sure that this building process is very secure? Because it's very easy to introduce security issues with this.
Yeah, first dive in the process and the environment. But first the process. Let's see what kind of things do we need to cover, like the secure build. You talk already about security. What kind of aspects around security do we need to look into?
Well, I think it's good before we dive into the aspects is to define what we mean when we are talking about build, right? Because when we are doing build on an infrastructure project, it's completely different than when we are talking about build when we are about a .NET application where you need to generate stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's the initially, because after that we can start thinking, okay, there are multiple parallels that will be we can discuss and see, okay, what are the security challenges and on that aspect. Is that a good intro?
Yeah, that sounds good. I think it's a good thing that you're saying, like, we're not just releasing source code onto a machine, like, and also if we're talking about stuff like infrastructure as code or like bicep or stuff like this, you're not sending the bicep files to Azure. You're actually sending, the result. So I think the build process could really be summed up as, taking the source of a project and turning it into an artifact, turning it into something that will eventually run on a machine somewhere. And that can take many forms. Like in .NET, you're compiling an application. With like a normal website, you're maybe just minifying it, but the HTML, the CSS, and JavaScript stays the same. And with Bicep, well, Bicep is just turning it into ARM templates in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what we also were discussing on before the start is how the build is also changing, right? Because with the introduction of the infrastructure as code, for example, what I told you guys earlier, in the early days, when we did the infrastructure as code in Azure DevOps, we needed to do build and then create an artifact which we could use in the release to deploy it, which is now not the case anymore as well, right?
Kinda. So now you used to like click ops the pipeline together with your by hand, and it worked and it was really nice to begin with. But you didn't really have any backups. It wasn't in your Git repository or something like that. Yeah. Nowadays, exactly what you say, you had like you used to have like a build section and a release section, and nowadays the modern approach is to use like a YAML file with your pipeline in it, and in there you define all of the build steps, and then you can also define your release steps in there. Usually you do that in a separate stage or in a separate file, so it's nicely separated. But now it's a whole more, it's a different approach to building and releasing your application.
Yeah, so if you focus on let's start with the infrastructure as code, for example. If we take a look when we are doing infrastructure as code, or we are doing conditional access deployment through DevOps processes, right? Things, configuration as code. How do we see the build stage, and do we see any security issues in there as well?
When only having infrastructure as code and deploying workplace-related items, identity-related items, like conditional access, for example, can we deploy that in a secure way? And how should we do that?
So the authentication part, you mean, or is it
For example, if you need to connect to a certain Azure Active Entra ID environment, you need to deploy within the Entra ID. You need to deploy the conditional access policies.
Yeah,
and in this case, we need an app rack. That app rack needs some permissions.
right.
But how do we secure that optimally? So nowadays, we're using Key Vault. Is that the right way? Or do we store that in another way?
So I think where you're going to is like this is of course kind of Azure DevOps specific, but I think you're gonna you're leaning into like the service connections bit. Like how do we connect our Azure DevOps environment to our Azure environment to make the changes, and how do we create a secure connection?
It could be that could be the way, but you can also run a script on a PowerShell script, for example, or whatever.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a connection, and that connection can be established in different ways, in my opinion.
Yeah, you can definitely do multiple things. Yeah.
So what you often see is, I think at the moment that in Azure DevOps or you can create service connection, which you can use in your pipelines, for example. But we had also seen scenarios where people hijack the connection or the deployment process and then got the token out of the connectivity. And then through that, they hop through. So I think that's what you're meaning with the authentication part. With GitHub, it's different. I think you need to store, you cannot define connections. You need to define credentials, which you can use to connect.
Not really sure. I think under the hood, it kind of works the same in Azure DevOps, where you create like a service connection to Azure. You can like use like an app registration, for example, like a service principal under the hood. But more modern approaches are like using a managed identity or a workload federation, something. Does someone here know the correct term? Workload federation.
Federated credentials. That's something new. And that's really changing it, because it's like managed identity, but it's so you don't have a secret anymore. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah. And I think you can definitely use a PowerShell script, right? To like in your pipeline say, I want to connect to Azure, and instead of using a service connection, I'm just going to do it myself. You could, but I think this is going to come up often more in this episode. Is why would you do it yourself if you can use like a cloud hosted, Microsoft hosted, or provider hosted option like a service connection? Yeah,
and if we want to use that service connection, for example, what do we need to do to secure that optimally? Because last days, I talked to a few customers regarding phishing-resistant MFA. That is more user-based. Yeah. From a user perspective, there are multiple challenges regarding MFA and phishing with the MFA token and so on. Is that the same in the area with the service connection using a managed identity or service principal, whatever? Do we face the same challenges as well in creating connections between a DevOps environment, a GitHub environment, and a backend system, for example, Azure Active Directory or the build environment where you are publishing your software?
I think definitely. I think then it's more like if you're using service connections, what I'm trying to say is that then it really depends on how much access you give that Azure resource, right? Like in the end, you're using somewhere in Azure is defined a service principal, a user. Let's just say it's like a user, and that user is the thing that you're using in Azure DevOps to connect to your Azure environment. And I've seen a lot of cases where then they're like, oh, it's really difficult to manage that, so we're just going to give that service principal global admin, and there we go. And then, like what you said, like if you get your build process hijacked, for example, you're using like a task that you don't know is malicious, then that of course could misuse that Azure credential and like hijack your systems.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that you then, if I'm going to use service connections, if I'm going to use a PowerShell script, how much can I do? Like I want a minimal access.
Yeah, and I thought that we in the last few months we saw a few of these kind of cases that a certain user, a developer, is hacked, and that their password and the multi-factor token was stolen, and then they are into a DevSecOps pipeline or whatever, and then they running the software, and then the software with malicious code in it is deployed to customers. So that is. If a user, a developer has access to that managed instance, that app rack with a lot of rights in a certain environment, there could be potential big damage could be there.
Yeah, well, then definitely in cases like this, it's of course, how do you say that? Like if for example I was hijacked, right, and I can have administrator rights somewhere, then that is bad, but hopefully at least my credentials are not used in the automated build pipeline. Hopefully. That is hopefully, exactly. You see something you shouldn't do. You should definitely have like a separate entity or separate identity that connects to your Azure environment automatically. Of course, if someone has my token, they could probably go to the Azure portal, and if I have a lot of administrator, right, they can still delete stuff or delete the code. But at least it could not really be automated that much anymore. And then we're definitely going to have to talk about the, like exactly what you say, phishing resistant MFA, passkeys, passwordless authentication, and that kind of stuff. But don't know how well that fits in the build process here.
No. Now we were looking a little bit broader than only the build pipeline, but let's go back to the build process. What do we need to? We talked on some points. What do we need to cover next? Because we have a build,
right?
And then I would try to deploy that build. What do we need to do in that kind of steps? What do we need to do to secure? Where do we store the credentials that are using? Are we only using a service connection, or what is more within the build?
So I think also pointing a little bit to the last question, I think it's a great topic, and I think if you zoom out on that topic, it's the whole reason why we are having this podcast, right? Because it's not in one process where we can solve that kind of issue. So the whole DevSecOps, the idea is to build that checks and controls in every stage and every phase. So, for example, let's say we have that connection, and if we have the right permission, who can use that connection? And we have, as you mentioned, our workflow, instead of just somebody clicking it through the portal, but code defined, stored in our repository. And like we discussed last time, we have our branch policies and repo protection in place. It minimizes the impact, the chance that somebody can hijack our workflow to build steps into it without checks being done ahead. So I think, yes, there are possibilities are there, and I think there are a couple of big challenges when it comes to authentication side of the build or even release, because you're always working with service principals or user accounts or API keys which have permanent permission bases.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, you're talking really a lot like minimizing the chances that your build process gets corrupted, gets attacked.
Regarding on first time we talked about artifacts that we are not using anymore, and we're still using it, but not for infrastructure as code. If we look at nowadays,
right?
Should we use DevOps, GitHub, whatever, and why should we do that in a certain way? What are tools that we can use to optimally use it in the build process,
right?
And to see how we can move forward on that.
I got a couple notes for this. So one of the things that the tools, we're talking about toolings and how to optimize the security for your build and your build pipeline. There's definitely things that were also talked about in the last episode. So we talked about vulnerability scanning. We talked about container scanning. There's definitely still a mention here for like code QL, which is like checking your code quality and stuff like that. Maybe also vulnerabilities. You want to use those tools, and those tools are best used in a build environment. So before you do a deployment to your production environment, there's going to be some vulnerability scanning happening, and they're like, hey, in this version of the SQL that you're using in that package, we found a vulnerability, and the deployment will be stopped. And the stuff like this is really like how you can secure your code deployment process.
Yeah.
I think that is definitely something that with a DevSecOps approach you want to automate. You don't want someone to say, oh no, let's just take a look at the vulnerabilities. We'll look at the vulnerabilities each sprint, right? No one actually does that. That needs to be automated.
I mean, we had a great session on this topic with David, of course, on the DevSecOps, on the Defender for DevOps, sorry. So how Microsoft is also helping to bring visibility into that process of the build and release. So, for example, what you exactly said is you want to see which vulnerabilities are coming in the code maybe, but also in the configuration-wise. But maybe secret scanning, we know GitHub has it already, or the Advanced Security has it in-house. So with tools as Defender for DevOps, you can integrate, for example, with GitHub or with Azure DevOps, and then you step into the build process and into the PR process, right? Because then we can say, okay, if we create a PR to make certain changes, then this pipeline needs to run and then do some checks before we allow it to be merged. And if there are any findings like there is a static password in your code, or you are creating so if we go back to the infrastructure as code, you are doing storage account with weak encryption or with a VM with a public IP address.
Yeah.
You see that kind of configuration, or at least which can end up into being vulnerable already into that build process, and that will be integrated to Defender for DevOps as well. So in Defender for Cloud, and with what I really love about the Defender for DevOps is it has a feature, they call it PR integration, where the feedback goes back to your PR. So as a developer, you see, okay, I have a PR. On line 13, there was a static password found. And on line 15, I had an JSON template for a storage account, but I had a weak encryption model configured. So as a developer, you don't need to escape your environment for that build phase, but they come bring it back to you.
And with you're talking now about a Defender to secure your code and the tools that you're using. So Defender is integrating in GitHub and Azure DevOps. Are that the only tools that we are still using at the moment, or are there any other tool that we are using to create a build environment?
I think, to create a build environment?
Yeah, to create your build, to create your code.
Right. I think there's definitely, like I mentioned CodeQL a little bit. There's also things like Sonar Cube and Sonar Cloud that will also do a lot of code scanning for you. And that will also make sure that the thing that you are going to deploy is secure, or is at least secure enough according to the policies that you've set up.
Yeah, but in the other end, the question is more or less, we are still using GitHub at the moment.
Yes.
I don't know exactly. Are you still using GitHub as well?
I use Azure DevOps and Azure DevOps pipeline for work.
Yeah, but both are within the Microsoft ecosystem, more or less general products that we are using. Are there other tools like GitHub, like Azure DevOps, that people in the wild are using to create code?
Sure. Well, like to deploy their applications, maybe you mean.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah, there's like things like Jenkins, right, which used to be the thing
GitLab.
that used GitLab, Circle CI, I believe GitLab definitely. Circle CI is a really famous one. And
GitLab is an on-prem environment.
No, it's also served. It's also hosted for you if you
hosted, but you can also build it by yourself.
Yeah. GitHub as well, I believe. I think a part of it.
Not GitHub.
No, Azure DevOps in the past you could have it on-prem.
DevOps Foundation.
DevOps Foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
but Jenkins is a cloud service.
I'm not sure actually.
Or is that
I'm happy to not really use it that often.
For me, it's either, but If we are using tools like Defender or SonarQube or whatever to secure your code, is it possible to have that on the other tools as well? Because in my opinion, Defender is only available at the moment for GitHub and Azure DevOps. So within the Microsoft ecosystem, it's okay. But if we extend that and we want to extend that to other developers, probably we can make a switch there as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I think the good thing about GitHub and Azure DevOps and that kind of stuff is that all of these things like vulnerability scanning, secret scanning, and hopefully in the future things like automatic package updates, it's just all integrated into GitHub, into Azure DevOps. For other platforms like GitLab and what we talked about also, you can definitely still install SonarQube, but it's more of a manual job. But I think, regardless of the platform you're using, you should be using these kind of tools to ensure that what you're going to deploy is secure and meets your expectations.
Yeah, and in the modern world, we're using GitHub, for example, or Azure DevOps, and we try to, within the build process, we want to do everything within GitHub. Like credentials, like a service connection, like code scanning, everything.
Yeah, definitely use the tools and the options that your provider gives you. Don't start building stuff yourself. There's nothing really wrong with building stuff yourself. But who's going to maintain it? Who's going to maintain that PowerShell script that might be using an old version of the Azure API? Just use Azure DevOps Service Connections, and Microsoft will host it for you. Another thing I might want to bring up into this process thing to kind of move away from the tooling. So as a developer, if I think about like securing the build process, for me, it's really important to also make sure that what you are trying to build and trying to publish is secure. There's a lot of articles online about people that accidentally also commit and build their Git folder. So they actually deploy their .git folder to a website. And then if you visit the website, you can just go to /.git and steal all of the source code. So that's also definitely a thing that you, when you're going to build something, really inspect what is the result of that build. And am I deploying, for example, stuff like the git ignore file that's really not necessary? Am I deploying some files that should actually be in the git ignore? Where is my git folder in there? Because it really shouldn't be. You want to make sure that your build is optimized. And
so let's search the internet. Let's search the internet.
Yeah, there's tools for that. There's tools of that you can just it will just go through tons of websites on the internet and just go to /.git and bam, you got all the source code.
You have the whole Git history then. From
you have all the source code, and that's also the thing that I always tell people. Like sometimes they commit a secret into their repo, and they're like, "Oh no, I'm just gonna put another commit on top of it to revert that." But I'm like, no. If someone has access to your Git history, they can just go back to last month, and they'll find the original thing again.
The same is for PRs. So some people say, okay, I have multiple commits in my PR, and that contains a secret, and then but I merge it and I smash it to one.
No.
Still in the history of your PR, you can find it. So
just a bit of self-promotion. I have a blog post on my website about all this. No, but exactly. You want to, but if you're using.
But how do you control that then?
So what you do is, if you're using stuff like GitHub or if you're using stuff like Azure DevOps, there's this feature called GitHub Advanced Security or GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. And this contains tools that you can just click. With one click, you can enable it. And then it will actually, like every time when you try to push code to Azure DevOps or to GitHub, it will scan all of your code. And if there's a secret in there, which it just learns, machine learning, it's just smart. And then it will just reject your push. And that's
what GitHub has, right?
Yeah, but also Azure DevOps.
Yeah, that's pre-commit checking if there's a password.
Yeah, but on the server as well. On the server, it checks it. So the server receives a request with the new code, and then before it accepts it, it scans it for secrets.
Yeah.
And there's also really, really interesting where GitHub does is if it, for example, there's services like SendGrid, right, for email sending, and those API keys, like you said, they're just like permanently valid, which is a big problem. If that leaks, you have an issue. You have a really big issue. So a lot of companies are now doing that. The API key starts with like a prefix. Like for SendGrid, I think it's SG and then a colon. And then what GitHub does is when it detects a secret starting with SG and colon, it will automatically send us a request to SendGrid to invalidate that API key. Which is like, even if you leak the secret, it will be immediately invalidated.
You can do that as well for your own projects. You can define your own keys, which it will search in other repositories, I believe.
That is useful, but it is scary because, like, if the secret just doesn't meet that regular expression or something, or doesn't meet the filters, then it will leak through. But yeah, definitely want to make sure that your code. And also what I do in my pull requests, I have a pull request template set up. So every time one of my team members has a pull request, I have like a little checklist that you can just create in GitHub and Azure DevOps. Like, did you add documentation? Does the project requirements need to be updated? For example, if you add a connection to a new database, you need to update so people can use that. We also have in there, it's a bit of a manual thing, but like, did you leak any secrets? Yeah. And I hope to make people think twice. Like, first of all, I always tell people don't put them in your repo and all that kind of stuff. I try to teach them about it, but also make it part of the PR flow that you actually have to visually check that checkbox.
It's a check mark that you need to check, and it's visible, so you see it. It's visible, and you think twice.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what you realize with that one.
You definitely want to automate it, but it's also just good to teach people. Just don't Don't rely on tooling too much. Like, then people are just not going to think about it anymore. They're going to work in an environment where these tools are not in place, and then things are going to go and start.
In the normal user environment, we have security awareness to educate people with phishing, with clicking on URLs, and so on and so on. Within the Defender for DevOps, or in the DevSecOps world, we need to create awareness regarding these kind of stuff. So, do you have a secret stored in your code, or do you use other stuff that is malicious? Probably can do stuff that you don't want to that it does. Yeah. I think awareness is one of the key aspects within a DevSecOps world.
Yeah, definitely. That's also the thing that we're trying to integrate, right? Like the DevOps thing, it kind of exists. Lots of companies are doing it. It's so much better than doing stuff manually, or Lisa's computer is the production release machine. You know, that's just that you don't want to work like that. You want an automated system, and making it secure is very important.
Yeah, that's why what I really love that I think I mentioned it a couple of times on the PR integration of Defender for DevOps. I mean, it doesn't forces the developer to come to a security environment and the vice versa. So, but they talk the same on the same platform that they need to intend. But if we take a look on the build, right? So on the build side, there are credentials involved. And I think from our perspective, it's often about some ARM templates, PowerShell coding, and that kind of. But I think when you are building an application, you have more requirement to that agent where you do the build, right? So bring us to that. What if you are doing a build of an application? What are the requirements often that you are meet? Because I can imagine that organizations say, "Well, you can do this, but it needs a certain version of Java or .NET, or it needs a certain network connectivity." Do you use like the GitHub runners and the Azure DevOps runners, or do you use your own stuff?
We can talk about that. That's really interesting. One little thing that I wanted, we talked kind of about this yesterday, and you triggered me about something. So one thing that I want to talk about, it's really interesting, is that there's also now, instead of like building your own CI/CD pipeline and having to think about what version of Java you're using, are we using Ubuntu 20 or are we using Ubuntu 18? A lot of people are still using Ubuntu 18. They shouldn't do that anymore. There's also these approaches in Azure where you can just say, hey, this is my GitHub link, and this is a React project. Go release it. And again, Azure will just figure it out for you. So you don't even need to think about it anymore. Just when there's a new commit on main, when some code is finished, Azure will automatically detect it, kind of in a GitOps approach, just push it to the server. And then it's even more secure because you don't even need to think about the builds anymore.
Yeah, we have the same with Sentinel, for example, where it's a little bit different what they are doing. Sentinel is Microsoft SIEM solution, so it's where they bring all the alerts and incidents together to create an overview, which we use often for our SOC and that kind of services. But what they do is you have also repository integration. And if you go and you say click and say, is it on DevOps or on GitHub? You say it's on GitHub. It has authenticate to GitHub. And what they do is they install an extension which creates a deployment workflow for you on the. So I think even there are multiple versions because it looks like that Sentinel is pulling that. But because you created that connection, you installed an extension, which is doing
it's pushing it. You mean something like that? Yeah. But it's just another thing that could be automated and could be secured by Microsoft. But let's go back to what you're like. Let's go back a step to what you're saying about like as a developer, what do I need? Because if we're thinking about deploying Bicep, we're deploying ARM, we're deploying Terraform, we usually don't need that much, right? I think I'm just saying, you guys probably need stuff like your only thing you need is probably like some Linux machine with like the
PowerShell,
with PowerShell,
Azure PowerShell, and all
stuff
that.
like that is all you need. But for like a developer, for me, so I'm like deploying maybe an application with a backend that's written in .NET, a front end written in React. So I'm gonna use modern.NET, so I'm running on Linux. But I definitely need a specific .NET version installed. I need a version of NPM installed, maybe Yarn, maybe a lot of project dependencies that it all needs to pull in. And there's a lot more dependencies to build. Luckily, with stuff like Docker, which we also kind of mentioned, some of this pain goes away because you can just let Docker do all of this. But yeah, you definitely need more dependencies, which you also hope are secure.
So do you use, even when you need to have certain specific version of software or tooling, the public hosted and managed versions of GitHub or Azure DevOps, or do you use your own? Because there has been, I think, definitely in the past, there has been a lot of discussions like sharing and build agent with multiple organization, and there were some scenarios that people could see things that they shouldn't be able to see.
Oh yeah, I remember it.
So
yeah, you're right. I always use.
That's a true risk, right? If we are talking about build, being able. So if you are running your program and I'm running my program on the same build agent, and I find a way to escape and then pull your code out there as well. We talked about the connection, right? To take over the connection, but maybe instead of connection, we can step in and change the code or pull some of the code away.
I think it's like, there's this security thing where if you're securing your house, the only thing you need to care about is that your house is more secure than your neighbor, because then the robbers will rob your neighbor and not you. Probably. And if I'm thinking about like setting up either my own like hosted agent where my code is built on, like I have a VM in Azure somewhere that runs and builds all my code, I have the agent installed on it, or I'm just using the Microsoft agent. I prefer to use the cloud version. We at the company I work in the beginning, we did use we just had our own VM, and then I don't know, there was one guy that always took care of it, right? He was a great guy, he was really good at what he did, and at some point he was working on some other stuff. 4 years later, we discovered that there were no updates. It's like, and that's the thing, like if you're working, depends really on the company, on the company culture as well. If there's actually security specialists in there, if there's ops people on there, and you're building really important code that really needs to stay in your environment, and your people are specialized in keeping that stuff up to date.
Yeah, but if you are self-hosting stuff, then you need to take care of lifecycle management.
Exactly.
And the update, not only updating, but also from a security perspective, on day one, we have a 0 day, so you need to update. On the second day, there's an open port that is discovered because you need to connect to an agent on a specific port, and that's in that specific scenario needed. But 2 months later, that specific scenario has changed. Yeah, you need to change that port, close it, open another one, or whatever. But you need to take care of all the stuff on-prem.
Yeah.
And if you're using a cloud agent, for example, then Microsoft or someone else is taking care of all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And you have it on about your own house. Secure it morely than your neighbor, because otherwise you're robbed. But what if you are living in an apartment where you have one house with 10 apartments, and the main entrance should be secured, and that's the people from the apartment building that are securing that entrance. So in that case, it's the same for the cloud agent, where I use the same agent as you do with your own company. Yep. And Microsoft or another vendor needs to take care of the security on top of that agent that is running.
Yeah.
But also, if it's multi-thread, so multiple organizations are using the same agent and so on. So Microsoft is taking care of that.
Yeah, but the thing is for me that, I'm not a security specialist. I do like to think that I know a bit about security. Otherwise, I might not be sitting here. But my job is to develop applications. It's to kind of, come up with architecture for applications. My job is not to secure stuff. So I cannot in good conscience use a self-hosted agent because I know that Microsoft will do a much better job securing it. And it's, if you're working at a company, like what is your core thing that you're working on? Like a web shop's core thing is building a web shop. So should they also be building their own identity provider? No, they should use a built one. Are you working at like, I don't know, like an airline or like at a bank? You might be using your own agents because it's really important to you that you need to manage it yourself. For normal companies, this is just not their thing. So I really advocate for using the cloud version.
Yeah.
And Microsoft has people working there 24/7 to keep that stuff secure, and any 0 days should be fixed immediately, and you don't even need to think about it.
From a lifecycle perspective, I totally agree. But if you let's look in that apartment house where Microsoft needs to close the first door. If you are running multi-thread agents, you are running on the same agent as I do. How do I know that is secured, that I can access your code in case of?
I think that's more of an implementation detail, if I'm honest. Like, I know that there's probably, like, let's say there's 10 VMs, right? And you're thinking that you're working on the same VM. It's probably some Docker host. It's probably some Hyper-V stuff. Maybe it's running on the same machine, but the only thing you may be sharing is a kernel underwater. I'm not sure even how it works. I don't need to think about it.
Well, I think they are changing definitely with GitHub. It has been a big shift on Azure DevOps. It was mainly on. I hear myself very weird. Is it me or?
No.
Okay. On Azure DevOps, it was always a hosted Windows, and the agent just run that. But when we went to the migration to GitHub, GitHub's all hosted containers. And I believe Azure DevOps is also now using mainly because they share that backend.
I mean, I've been using hosted Linux agents on Azure DevOps for at least 6 years, I think.
Yeah.
But
are there now really VMs or are they already changed to a container, I believe?
I'm pretty sure you can run a Docker container with the Azure DevOps agent in it.
Yeah.
You can definitely do that. So that would already make it easier, right? You can just kind of get the latest version of that agent and it will update all of the vulnerabilities. Again, something you have to manage yourself.
Yeah.
But if I want to deploy that to an Azure subscription, or I deploy that specific application on a certain environment, do I need to integrate that agent within my own environment, or is what are you?
That's a good question. I mean, where do you actually where do you put it in your infrastructure somewhere? Where do you put it in your landscape? One of the most often attacked environments, I think, or one of the most popular things to attack in a company is the build server, because sometimes people don't really care about it. They don't keep it up to date. So if you can just hijack that, you can just find all the source code there. You can find all the credentials there. So maybe you want to sandbox it, I guess. I feel like you really do not want it to have access to all of your on-premise or all the other servers.
Yeah.
At the other hand, if you're deploying to virtual machines from the build agent, it has to have access to the VMs, right? Because it needs to be able to put the artifacts on there.
Yeah, so that's, I think, in my opinion, one of the biggest, one of the reasons why we see that people or customers ask for having self-hosted agents.
Self-hosted?
It's often, it has to do with networking.
Yeah, well, I had a little thing about that.
Because they have like networks, databases or something in the on-prem environment or in the cloud environment, which is not... the same is, you will get the same issue when, for example, if you go even to cloud, right? If you go to, let's say you have an Azure Web App where you have everything VNet integrated and you have an Azure SQL as a backend. So your Azure SQL is not publicly accessible anymore. Mm-hmm. And then you are going to do a build, you are going to push the changes to your SQL database. That's not accessible anymore.
True. I had a little note about that because some time ago I read that GitHub now does support this. So GitHub supports using a cloud hosted agent, so you don't need to think about it anymore. Mm. But you can then talk to VNet integrated stuff on Azure. I'm like 99% sure I'm right that I read about this. And then, of course, the first million comments were, when will this be released for Azure DevOps? So I just looked that up because I believed it was completely impossible to use like a Microsoft Cloud hosted agent and deploy to VNets in Azure. And it kind of is. The thing that Microsoft says on their documentation is that you just need to whitelist some IPs. And they change every week. They say they could change every week. So every week they upload a new list, and then you need to upload those and whitelist those every week.
But you can automate that.
Yeah, but that's not new, guys. that's the same as whitelisting the whole Western Europe data center IP address space.
Yeah.
I mean, I had once a customer that said, give me I'm not going to whitelist that. I'm not going to open the firewall. Give me the IP address that I need to whitelist. You can download it. It's thousands and thousands of IP addresses.
And it changes. The additions, they remove IP addresses and so on. So changes are a lot.
So one of the other reasons we use self-hosted containers on Kubernetes. And one of the reasons why we did that is because through that model, we have now the option to use the managed identity. You can do the same as well with the VMs, the self-hosted. So in Azure DevOps, you have like two versions, the VM agent, but the one that's with the managed identity, I believe, I don't know.
Exactly like you can create like an Azure service connection with a managed identity, and that will be used by the cloud-hosted agent.
Yeah, so what you do is you use the managed identity of the agent to authenticate to your Azure subscription, for example, to do some activities.
Yes, exactly.
So that's also a really awesome technology.
Well, that's kind of the same thing you're doing, right? You just have
containers.
You have the kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question about this. So let's say that let's think in a modern way. So GitHub, if I'm correct, has the option to use a cloud-hosted agent, which you don't need to update, which you don't need to maintain. Microsoft or GitHub cares about all the security aspects of it, which is great. I can sleep at night. And let's say that it's correct that they can just talk to VNet integrated resources, so things that the internet cannot access. Let's say Azure DevOps gets this as well. Would you then still want to use self-hosted agents?
So for us, it's double. We do it partially so we use the build agents partially to use the managed identity, for example, to configure and maintain our own solutions, right? So our own platform and that kind of stuff, which are not internet facing. But we also use that managed identity to do other stuff, to other resources, for example, without going too deep in it. So how do I say it without saying too much about this? That's the fun part. But what you can do is, for example, if you in a scenario that you are an MSP, right? You're not doing nothing with security. You're an MSP, and you are using Azure Lighthouse to manage your customers. Normally, you need to have a service principal, which is going there. So you have always an app registration with a secret, which is vulnerable for that. So in that scenarios, you can also decide to go to managed identities of your containerized solution. So when you are doing something as infrastructure as code to your customer, or you are doing as your landing zone configuration, you can use those connections to do the provisioning of that environment. So in our opinion, being able to using that managed identity, but it solves a lot of the problem that you initially mentioned.
But I don't really understand the difference though between using I configure like a managed identity in Azure for my Azure DevOps or GitHub Action build, right? Build agent. This is the one that's made by Microsoft in the cloud somewhere. And I only use that one for deployment permissions. It's not going to be allowed to change Azure settings, that as little access as possible. You're doing kind of the same thing. You're hosting your build agent yourself, but you're also talking about the managed identity access. But how does that differ from what I'm saying with the service connection and managed identity?
Service connection with the managed identity.
Yeah, you're saying on your Kubernetes environment, you can configure a managed identity. It's not only
Kubernetes, right? It can be a VM as well. It can be a Docker container instance as
your
well.
pod in Kubernetes has a managed identity associated with it.
Yeah.
And in my Azure DevOps cloud-hosted agent also has a managed identity because of the service connection.
The hosted, but it's on the VM, right?
On the cloud hosted, yeah. So is your but
you don't have on the cloud hosted one. You don't have managed identity, right?
No. But the cloud hosted one uses a service connection to talk to Azure.
Yeah,
and that service connection uses a managed identity.
That is not possible, all right?
I'm pretty sure it is
a federated connection.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it is possible. Okay, let's just say
managed-
service principle.
Because the idea behind managed identity is that the identity is not managed by you,
It's
but by
managed by
Azure.
Exactly.
So you don't know the secret of it.
Exactly, and I would maybe we need to take this offline after
Yeah.
the podcast, have a look around. Maybe we can put it in the show notes or something like that.
Something like that. That would be awesome.
In any case, let's say that the security aspect would also be managed by Microsoft.
Yeah.
So the update parts would be managed by Microsoft. I could integrate with VNet. I could integrate with my private resources. Would there still be benefits to using self-hosted agents if the security aspect was handled by Microsoft in the cloud and if the VNet integration was handled by Microsoft?
Depends on your level of security, I think.
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point.
And the application and how much risk you accept. For example, if you are doing some infrastructure as code and deploying some resources, it's way different than if you are building databases and application and which are doing financial stuff or.
True. Yeah, that's a really good point.
So I think there's always a risk with a public hosted by someone else. From a modern way, I do accept it. Like if you're a small organization, you don't have the resources, don't start with it, right? I do completely, because you need to manage it. You have lifecycle management. You need to patch it. You need to monitor it. You need to have Defender on it. You need to react on it. So yeah, on that sense, I do agree with you guys that if you don't have the resources and the capacity to do it well, then don't do it. But if you have, but I think that's in always the case. If you have the resources, the budgets, and to maintain.
Yeah, if it makes sense financially, if you did your risk assessment and you're saying, well, this is a pretty big risk for our organization.
It depends on the use case.
It depends. So that's the great consultant answer here.
Yeah, definitely. I've one last thing. We talked about the build process, the build environment, but if we want to access from a developer perspective, if I want to access that build environment, to create code and so on, you're doing that on your own laptop.
I'm creating code on my own laptop, is what you're saying, right? Yeah, I'm using my local Visual Studio Writer, stuff like that. Yeah.
How can and maybe we need to take another episode on that. But how does DevBox within Azure DevBox, how does that come into place regarding the things that we're talking about? Because securing your build stuff is also securing the entrance, how you access your build.
Yeah, I think we talked a bit about this in the first episode about workstation management.
Yeah, but a bit.
Yeah, I talked to a colleague yesterday because they were working for a client, and I was like, "So what kind of environment are you using?" He said, "Like I'm using the Microsoft. What was it called? Microsoft
DevBox.
Microsoft or Azure DevBox or something." And he said it works really, really well.
Yeah.
We talked in the first episode about it that I've heard of people using it, or stuff like GitHub Code Spaces, which is even more as a SaaS platform. I think it is definitely very interesting, and we could maybe dedicate another episode to this.
Maybe I missed it, and maybe with that also our listeners. Can you maybe...
What is Azure DevBox?
That's a great point. Yeah, let's talk about that.
The DevBox is more or less a workplace within Azure that you can spin up, a sort of an AVD environment. It's not AVD. Don't
Azure Virtual Desktop.
It's not an AVD environment, but it's a virtual workplace that you run in Azure, so you can connect it remotely. But it's dedicated to a subscription or an environment that is used to develop stuff.
All the software needed for software development is already installed on it.
Yeah.
So instead of getting a new laptop from your work and spending 2 days configuring Visual Studio Code, GitHub, GitKraken, all your tooling, it's already all done for you. So you can just click on start, or there's a new developer.
It's a VM still.
It's under the hood. It's a VM. AVD probably as well. It's just AVD on steroids, I guess.
It's not AVD, but it's a VM where you can. But otherwise I hear it. People are complaining.
Going to be a dedicated session about this.
Yeah, definitely.
But very interesting.
But the DevBox, and that's one of the nicest experiences with that. It's dedicated to a subscription.
Mhm.
And with that, from a cost perspective,
Yeah, you can see
that
exactly.
subscription belongs to one project. So you have a project, you're running that project, and what are the costs of that for that the running cost for that project? So you have a subscription, all the costs are on that subscription. So you have a one project with that costs. So it helps also when you hire external people, they can get access to the DevBox and
Exactly.
and only if you are running a build pipeline or whatever, it's only based on that specific Azure subscription or multiple Azure subscription that you are attached to that DevBox. You can't access other resources in your environment. So it's really specific.
But
Very interesting.
I think I definitely have some more questions or things to say about this. I think it's definitely good to talk more about this later. But one little question about this. So how the build process, how is this related to DevBox?
Now, if we... The thought that was in my head was if we are building an application, so you're running a pipeline or whatever, we can secure that on an optimal way, but accessing that build pipeline, if you don't secure the access to your build pipeline, and we talked a little bit about in the first episode regarding a workplace,
Right.
but on the other hand, you can access a GitHub environment. You do authentication with multi-factor and so on. But if you have your source code within a Visual Studio Code,
on your local machine, so it's like, exactly. So
that was the reason why it pops up in my head.
Exactly. You could definitely secure and like put all the security measures in place to make sure that your code is deployed securely onto your landing zone, wherever you're putting it.
Yeah.
Then we kind of go back to the question of how do you secure the access to the thing that is being built. And that could be exactly something like DevBox, like where, on the other hand, I feel like you could, pry this laptop from my cold dead hands. Like, I love having a own laptop, but that you're completely right that if I left the company somewhere, I could still have that code on my laptop.
Yeah.
I could take that with me. With DevBox, you could just, disable my Azure account.
Then you don't have access.
And you're done.
to it.
You don't need to format my computer anymore. It doesn't need to collect dust for 5 years in a closet somewhere.
I think I know someone from the Microsoft team who is on DevBox. So we probably can invite a special guest to have
cool.
a specific scenario or a specific episode on DevBox. Let's do that.
Sure.
Sounds really good.
And regarding the build process, environment, and stuff, that we need to take another thing, or did we miss something?
Maybe a simple thing that I sometimes see people do. I think we definitely talked a lot about making sure that your build process is secure, making sure that you have like a well-fitting build environment, like either self-hosted or like cloud-hosted, making sure that it fits. One little thing that I sometimes see people do is that they're kind of new to this build process, and they're like, oh, I need a specific task, right? And then they're looking on the marketplace for like GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps tasks. You really want to make sure that the tasks you're using are okay tasks.
Yeah.
Like there's even settings in Azure DevOps, I believe, to not allow marketplace tasks. Because you could have everything secured, but then you download a task that just copies all of the source code and sends it to Russia. You
Don't do that.
Bleep that out, please.
You could. So you definitely want to make sure that the tasks you're using are secure. They're trusted. And because you don't know the source code of the task, you don't know what they're doing. Yeah. So the things that are happening in your build, you want to make sure that those are okay, those are secure.
That's a really good one, because I think that's happening more often than people.
Yeah, exactly. I need to replace some tokens. Oh, yeah, now I know that this one has 600 downloads, and the last update was 4 years ago, but it does what it needs to do. So I'm just going to use that one.
Yeah.
It's like,
So we spoke about the technology, and I think the last one was great. But is there also a human interaction that we can discuss if it comes to RBAC, more role-based access requirements? What do we expect from our team when it comes to?
I think if you're like running a build pipeline, it's also definitely you want to make sure that only specific people can run specific pipelines. Where like deploying your cloud resources in a really big corporate environment, maybe only the ops people need to be able to deploy actual Azure production resources. There needs to be the 4I principle, where if I want to change the connectivity stuff in Azure, all of the VNet stuff, all the connections to Azure Firewall. You want to make sure that your colleague Steve, that is also really good and, works with is specialized in this. He also needs to have a look at it. That's kind of, I guess, the human aspect. You want to automate your build process. That's the entire thing about DevOps and kind of. But you want to also make sure that when specific and important things are happening, that's, I think, where you need a human to double check.
Yeah, but also role-based. You have a pull request. It need to be approved and so on. Just before the build is actually running.
Yeah.
The 4 eyes principle, maybe 6 eyes. That you want to cover. I think that's important. And also what you mentioned a few minutes earlier regarding the list that you need to approve, the check marks that you need to do before moving into PR. Yeah, I think that are things, the awareness. We talked a little bit about that. The awareness also within the DevSecOps, the DevOps people. Yeah, that needs to be raised, in my opinion.
Yeah, we want to make sure we want to know what we're deploying. Like I think that's a good way to say it. We want to know what we're deploying, and the deployment should happen automatically. That is what we're doing all of this for. We just want to have code, and we want it to run on production. And we don't want to use Lisa's computer to do that. We want to use a cloud-hosted agent, a self-hosted agent. Just let it happen. But what is being deployed? Okay. You don't know that thing? It's like a whole old joke about
I don't know
one computer
I
in
know
the
Lisa.
office.
But
You know Lisa? I don't know. Introduce her to me. No, but
that's on the flight and the 8th.
Sure thing. So, like one specific one team member's laptop is always used to deploy to production, and that's an old whatever.
We all know that scenario with customers, that there's always one server that has enough permission to do the deployment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have faced that personally with a really big enterprise customer when it came. Everything needed to be DevOps and everything needed to be infrastructure as code, but then you needed to email the code to somebody, and then that person went to an SSH, to an Ubuntu server, because that server had the right login already to the Azure side. So they run it manually there, and then they deployed it.
Nice.
I can add
really
one more thing.
Yeah.
To add one more thing on top of that, I used to do an internship, and I also finished my studies at the Dutch tax services, the Belastingdienst. And it was also, I worked at a very modern department there where they built a mobile app. So it was really fun. And they also started doing deploy build agents, CI/CD in there. So the code was built, the quality was tested, all the stuff we talked about today. And then there was a step to go to a specific Bali, to go to a specific place in the company where you had to fill in an A4 paper, and then afterwards the process would continue, which I just found really, really funny. It's all super automated until you get to the deeper and deeper parts where you actually need to write a piece of paper and go somewhere. And
It's not particularly wrong. It's good that you have to sign off.
I guess in a government environment, yeah.
But on the other hand, we want to try to digitalize everything, and then if you need to sign a paper, it could be weird for some people. But on the other hand, if you need to take that step. So for awareness perspective, I think it's really good.
Yeah. Okay. I guess. Yeah. I mean, everything could of course be optimized better, but you do definitely have a point, especially.
But that's more to cover the change management than I think, right?
I guess a little bit who is authorizing the deployment, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
but
because that's
fun.
A big important thing, I think, in our next episode, because I believe the next one is going to be about release then.
I'm not really sure. We'll have to take a look.
Yeah. Okay. But because the change management is going to be a big one, I think, because when it comes to build and deployment. We deploy more often than we did previously.
Definitely.
Right? So maybe in the past we did collect all the changes, and then we did a deployment once a month or something in that sense. Okay. But now we are doing multiple ones. So, and this is a really challenge I had this with a couple of customers of mine that say, okay, we need to be in control. We need to see how much deployments we did to the production environment. But I think we will take that for the next episode.
Let's close this one.
Yeah,
we are almost an hour far, so we make that.
Yeah, we need to have a clock here, I think.
Let's look a little bit back. We covered the build process, the build environment, We talked about a little bit DevBox, make a little step outside.
Little side step, yeah.
We talked about securing code, also within this episode. So I think there are lots of aspects within the build that comes into place, and that makes this one of the interesting topics, steps within creating an application or building an infrastructure. You need to take care of your build because a lot can go wrong within this step.
Yeah, definitely.
So we talked about Defender for DevOps in a few episodes earlier on the what was it? The Defender for Service of the Defender for Cloud and for series.
Yeah.
So if you want to, if you are interested in that one, have a look at that episode. On the other hand, that was it for today. Build, and let's look into the next one. Probably release
or something in that.
Maybe it's Summit. We'll see.
Yeah, let's see if we can connect with some people over there and see if we can create some other content on the other side of the ocean.
Definitely.
Let's do that. So thanks for today. If you like this this podcast series, like and subscribe, and also let us know if you want to know more about a specific scenario or what else. We will take care of that and see if we can create a next episode on that. So reach out to us on the socials, and I see you next time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.